The battle for Aleppo is over. Syrian troops retake the city, but is it the beginning of the end of the civil war? What options are left for opponents of Bashar al Assad's regime? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It has taken 4 years of bombing and bloodshed, hundreds dead, tens of thousands homeless, a city largely destroyed. Syrian government forces, backed by Russian and Iranian allies, announced they had recaptured eastern Aleppo from opposition rebels. Russian leaders say the fall of Aleppo is a major victory against people the Kremlin calls terrorists. The Syrian government used boots on the ground, airstrikes and siege tactics to win back the city where opposition fighters seized control in 2012. A ceasefire brokered by Russia and Turkey on Tuesday was supposed to end the fighting, and the besieged rebels and civilians given a safe passage out. Within a few hours, shelling of the city intensified, and buses sent to evacuate thousands of Syrians returned empty. Aleppo used to be Syria's economic hub, but now lies in ruins. Caroline Malone looks back at how the city became ground zero for the country's civil war.
From a flourishing economic capital and home to more than 2 million Syrians, to a war zone, death and destruction. In 5 years, Aleppo city has been torn apart by fighting between government forces, opposition supporters and various rebel groups. Protests, both pro and anti-government 5 years ago, spiralled into war. The city was divided, with the east becoming an opposition stronghold and under siege. Since August, supply routes to the east were cut off and hospitals destroyed. In recent days, around 80,000 people have been trapped in only a few neighbourhoods as Syrian and Russian airstrikes continued.
Don't believe anymore in the United Nations. Don't believe anymore in the international community. Don't think that they are not satisfied with what's going on. They are satisfied that we are being killed. We wanted freedom. We didn't want anything else but freedom.
The UN says at least 37,000 people have escaped eastern Aleppo and need aid, but tens of thousands of others are thought to remain. Landmark buildings, including World Heritage sites, are destroyed. These before and after photos were posted to an Aleppo restaurant's Facebook page. On the other side of the former divide in western Aleppo, there have been celebrations. It's a major victory for government supporters. And a blow to the opposition, losing control of a major Syrian city. Many more people have lost their homes, their work and their lives. Caroline Malone for Inside Story.
We will get to our panel in a moment, but first let's bring in Save the Children's senior conflict advisor, James Denzelo, to discuss the humanitarian situation on the ground. James, the battle for Aleppo seems to be over, but if you think of the victims and the devastation there, it's not really a victory for anyone, is it?
Yeah, and I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are still tens of thousands of civilians trapped in a very small pocket of territory in East Aleppo. So while the narrative of government of Syria victory is certainly one that's coming out, the fate of those individuals is very much on the table. And I think there was a lot of hope yesterday when that ceasefire deal and that evacuation plan was agreed. And that hope has unfortunately been dashed as airstrikes and cluster bomb use and artillery has resumed today. So there's some serious questions as to remain as to what will happen to those civilians in the coming hours.
And how worried are you about their safety, considering the stories that we are hearing of abuses from all sides?
Hugely worried. The UN put out a report yesterday about 82 civilians who were summarily executed on the street. There are a lot of people there. They've been cut off from aid, from medical access for over 100 days. The temperature in Aleppo is dropping below freezing in the evenings. So this is a very vulnerable population who are being exposed to incredibly dangerous weapons of war. And the smaller the areas they're forced into, the higher the likelihood of these weapons killing large numbers. And unfortunately, those are the reports we're hearing right now.
So the situation has been dire. As you say, the city is devoid of all basic necessities. What state are the people in, and where do they go?
Well, people, I mean, because there's been no official organised corridors or safe ways out of the war zone, you've seen people die in the process of trying to flee. People are going in all directions. And as you alluded to, there's been some very worrying reports about arbitrary detention, about especially adult males vanishing, some stories of forced conscription. And I think that the UN has made clear that they believe they should be sort of upscaling their presence to be able to observe and making sure there's accountability for that. But ultimately, we still are in the chaos of conflict, despite the fact that people are calling it a victory.
And so many players, as we've seen over the last 5 years or so, James, that's one of the big problems, and the fact that Aleppo is just one city. We've seen this in other places too.
Exactly, and we shouldn't forget there was a new report released today showing that 1.3 million Syrians across the country are living under siege currently. So while Aleppo is clearly a symbolic and strategic, very important moment in this conflict, it is by no means the end. Next March we will mark the 6th year anniversary of this terrible conflict, and there's no sign at all that it'll end, and it seems to constantly mutate and change. There are 12 countries currently military involved, 90 armed groups, and ultimately Syrian civilians are paying the heaviest price.
James Denzelo, thank you very much. Let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Gaziantep, Rami Jara, a Syrian political activist and journalist who is covering the Syrian war. In Damascus, Taleb Ibrahim, Syrian political analyst and former deputy director of the Damascus Center for Strategic Studies. And in Beirut, Assad Al-Aishi, executive director of Beitna, Syria. Very warm welcome to all three of you. Taleb Ibrahim, is that it as far as Aleppo is concerned? Done and dusted, wrapped up, victory for Bashar al Assad?
Yes, this is not a victory for Bashar al Assad. It is a victory for the Syrian state, because the city 3 years and a half is out of the control of the central government in Damascus, and this is a victory for all of the Syrian population. I don't think it is a personal victory for anyone. I hope that after what had happened in Aleppo, all Syrians should be able to sit down to the table of negotiation. And me personally, I don't believe in war at any way, but this war was imposed on Syrians. All Syrians were involved in this war, and it is not for the privilege of Syrian society or Syrian state. It has other goals. Now, we hope that what happened in Aleppo should be as a beginning for a new era in this long war, which we hope to see it ending very, very soon.
Assad Al-Aishi, do you think that this is possibly a turning point in the war in Syria?
It's definitely a turning point in the ongoing war and in the attempt by the Assad regime to annihilate his opponents or the opposition in general. Does that mean it's the end? It's absolutely not the end. It's just the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. It's a beginning of a phase where we are going back to a rural insurgency, as the opposition has lost the only city, or the last remaining city, big urban center under its control. So we're going back to a rural insurgency. We're going back to seeing different forms of resistance to the hegemony of this dictator and his regime. What would that translate into is yet to be seen. But our biggest fear as civil society organizations is that we're going to see a re-emergence of extreme violence or of violence extremism.
Because this is what we see over and over, don't we, when fighters are pushed into a corner, when they start to resort to more desperate measures.
Absolutely. So the biggest fear is further radicalization and then going into Daesh 2.0 or ISIS 3.0, or something that might be 10 times more violent than what we've seen currently. I mean, let's not forget that as the regime forces were advancing into eastern Aleppo, so was the Islamic State into Palmyra. 2 days ago, Palmyra fell in the hand of the Islamic State again. And the T4 airport was as well entered by the Islamic State forces, the so-called Islamic State, which is the epitome of this conflict, as the two extreme organizations or two extreme parts of this conflict, the Assad regime and the Islamic State, are advancing to crush basically whatever is left of a possible moderate opposition in Syria.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on that point a little later on, but let me bring in you, Rami Jari. How significant is what we have seen in Aleppo to the bigger picture now in Syria?
Well, Jane, it's very significant. I mean, I'm listening to one of your guests, who is a political strategic analyst from Damascus. If we're to ask this question to many of the Syrian population who actually know who this person is and know that he is not legitimate in his stance as a political analyst because he actually corresponds to the security apparatus of the Syrian regime. And of course he calls this a victory, and he calls it a victory for the majority, or he says the Syrian people in general, but I will put my comment into that. This is a victory in Syria. If Aleppo is taken, if Aleppo is destroyed in the sense that it has been brought to the ground in all of its areas, and its civilians have been forced to either go into regime territory and to bow their heads to a dictatorship, or to walk away somehow and die in shelling, or die in bunker-busting bombs or barrel bombs, and everything that we are witnessing happening in Aleppo today. Of course, this is a victory for those that are trying to destroy any opposition to the Syrian regime, any opposition that says that it will refuse to not have a voice, to not play a role in political life. This is definitely a victory. But for those in Syria that actually had some aspiration of a democratic state, a state that respected the rights of every single element of Syrian society, this is not a victory. This is a fallback into medieval times where people did not have those rights, where there was no such thing as democracy. And this is where we're headed now. Honestly now, if you look at the state of what is happening in many areas of Aleppo today, I find it very strange that the Syrian regime is able to continue to claim that it is fighting for autonomy of its state, when you have a state like Russia that is involved in negotiating a ceasefire, and the Syrian regime has no say in this. This ceasefire was being negotiated between the Russians and the Turks, and then that ceasefire is then broken by Iranian militias on the ground. The Syrian regime also has no say in this. There is no autonomy of a state in Syria at this stage. All we are seeing at this stage is that people are fighting for power on Syrian soil, and it is civilians that are paying the price.
Okay, let me get Taleb to respond to that. Do you agree that possibly there is no autonomy on the ground here, and that Syria is being manipulated as it is its own people into this farce of a democracy?
Firstly, the last gentleman is lying. I am not a part of the intelligence community in Syria. This is absolutely lies, and I challenge him to bring a proof. We use it that all opposition figures to lie, and they believe that we will believe them, or others of the audience will believe them when they lie. Syria is an independent state, and it has its sovereignty all over its territories. We are not under the hegemony or control of Russia. Yes, we are partners to Russia, we are partners to Iran. We have our allies, like others. Every country in the world have its allies, and we are working in coordination and cooperation with our allies. Anyhow, I think what had happened in Aleppo is a very, very great and very important thing, and it is a turning point in the future of the war. And I think that a lot of people in the opposition lost their minds after that great defeat in Aleppo. You were defeated, and you brought the war to Syria. Syria was a very, very important country in the Middle East.
Dr. Taleb. Right.
Go ahead, Rami.
This is total nonsense. I'm sorry, this is total nonsense. What we have seen in the past hour and a half is that Russian forces, Russian Air Force, have attacked the Rajdin front. The Rajdi front is a front that is led by Iranian militias on Syrian soil. What we're seeing on Syrian soil right this moment is a conflict between Russian and Iranian forces. One side that is trying to call for a ceasefire in respect to its relations with Turkey, and the other side that has broken that ceasefire because it wants to continue this ongoing massacre in Aleppo because it has become some sort of symbol that people have gone to Aleppo to fight. Hezbollah, Iranian militias.
And should we bring Assad in here? Assad, you were nodding there. Would you like to add to this discourse?
This is the Syrian... No, this is the Syrian regime narrative that you are leading, where you continue to bombard Syrian civilian life. This is not true. You can continue to push this lie, but it doesn't make sense. Your ambassador to the United Nations yesterday presented a picture saying that Syrian soldiers were welcoming Syrian civilians that were coming out of eastern Aleppo, and it was a picture that was stolen from Iraq. This is ridiculous. And this is exactly what you do. This is the art of deception.
Okay, I'd like to bring in Assad here because you have people in Aleppo, Assad, you have people on the ground, and I'm wondering if you see what's happening, the reality of all sides, all players, and the sort of impact that it's having.
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's start by some facts, because it seems that Dr. Talib is slightly out of sync with the realities on the ground. About 82 persons have been documented to be summarily executed in the past 48 hours. These are the documented cases. I'm not referring to what we're hearing on the ground. These are the documented. These are the documented cases. Dr. Talib, I listened to you till the end. I listened to you till the end. Please listen to me, and then you can react. That's absolutely fine. But please listen to me till the end. I would highly respect that. That's one. That's one. For two, when the agreement was reached yesterday between the Russians, the Turks, and the Syrian opposition in Ankara, it seemed that the Syrian regime abided by it as well. And there was effectively a ceasefire that was kind of respected by all parties as of 6 p.m. Aleppo time. The first convoy was supposed to be evacuated at 11 p.m. Aleppo time, and it was coordinated by all parties as well. It was cancelled at the last minute. It was reported to be happening at 5 a.m. But that was cancelled again at the request of the Syrian regime. The last time set for a humanitarian convoy of injured people to be evacuated, 35 injured people to be exact, was supposed to happen at 10 a.m. At 10 a.m., both parties on the ground, the Syrian regime forces and the Syrian opposition forces, were logistically ready to do these evacuations. It was actually the Iranian militias at 10:05 a.m. that started shelling the area where the evacuation was supposed to happen from. And they started to shell actually somehow indiscriminately, quite ironically. So there's definitely a disagreement. We cannot deny that there is definitely a disagreement between the different parties to this contract, if I may say, or to this agreement.
Okay, you know what I would like to do now, if I may? I want to throw
the Syrian regime forces.
I want to throw forward to what we can expect from now, considering all the different players, the promises that have been made and broken. Let's just take a quick look at where we are now as far as control is concerned. Rebels have controlled eastern Aleppo for 4 years, and capture of the entire city by the Syrian government is seen as a major setback for the opposition. As we were saying, the Syrian government has regained control of all major urban centres in the west: Homs, Hama, Damascus, and now Aleppo. It also controls the main road running through Syria, a major supply route for the rebel fighters. They locked in isolated small pockets across the country. Many of these areas marked in green are surrounded by government forces. What's not working so well is the government's campaign against ISIL, as Assad mentioned a little bit earlier on. Much of the ISIL territory marked in black is desert, but it includes all of Syria's major oil fields. Government forces suffered another blow this week when ISIL regained control of the ancient city of Palmyra. And the Kurds also control a large area marked in yellow in the north, close to the Turkish border. And Rami, I'm going to bring you in here, and I'm just wondering if this battle in Aleppo is going to backfire when it comes to ISIL? The fact that ISIL could walk so easily into Palmyra because possibly government forces' attention was elsewhere. Also, the fighting that we are seeing in Iraq, if ISIL is pushed out of areas there, will they also cross over into Syria now? Are we preparing for another battle?
Jane, I appreciate the context of actually explaining what's happening on, other areas in Syrian soil. And the fact is that there is a strategy to push ISIS out of Iraq into Syria. We've heard these statements being expressed by the American President, Obama, and the UK Prime Minister, who have clearly stated that the strategy is to push them further out of Iraq into Syria, because Syria seems to be this depot where terrorists are welcomed. And there is an important point here, is that all the focus is on Aleppo at the moment. What is happening in Aleppo? Not much focus is in Idlib, in Daraa, in other areas where massacres are being carried out. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the Syrian regime and the Russians claim that they're trying to fight terrorism, that their main priority today is to take out ISIS, the Islamic State. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the head of the Islamic State. This is the target. This is what we're trying to put down. This is what we're trying to crack down on. That's very funny, because what I see is a focus on Aleppo, an area that does not contain one fighter that fights in the name of the Islamic State, one person who supports the Islamic State. This is where the focus is, Aleppo. And in the midst of all this, we see an area, Palmyra, the historic state of Palmyra, is lost. Control is lost of this area to the Russians, to the Syrian regime. And who is it that makes an advance into these areas? It is ISIS, the Islamic State. So while the Russians and the Syrians are busy massacring people in Aleppo, 82 people that were massacred yesterday in bombings. We're talking about bunker busting bombs. We're talking about barrel bombs. We're talking about chlorine gas.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to bring in Taleb now, if you don't mind, Rami. Sorry.
That are supposedly targeted. Can I just finish this?
Okay.
Can I just finish this, Jane? Indiscriminate weapons that are being used against civilians in this area, Aleppo, this historic state, and yet they managed to lose control of another state to ISIS. Does this not show the international community, the audience, everyone that is watching this right now, that the aim is not to eliminate terrorism in Syria? The aim is to destroy any opposition to the Syrian state and to keep a dictator
let me put that to Taleb. If that is the aim, which I suspect you won't agree with, I mean, where does this leave the opposition? And I'm just wondering, we've got Donald Trump coming into power. He's close to the Russians. Does this mean that Bashar al Assad is all but secure now? He doesn't have to talk about leaving. He's in a stronger position. And where does this leave the opposition?
Bashar al Assad now in a stronger position, and he was strong all the time because he enjoyed support of his people. But please let me say two things about one of my colleagues said.
No, I do want to look forward, if I may. I want to look forward to where this leaves Bashar al Assad and the opposition.
Weak opposition, and you are talking about moderates. I don't know where are those moderates. Some of my colleagues said there are no terrorists in Aleppo. Of course, there are no members of ISIS in Aleppo, but there are Al-Nusra Front and other Al-Qaeda and the pro-Al-Qaeda organizations who are working in Aleppo. So the Syrian battle in Aleppo is battle against terrorism inside that city. But anyhow, if you ask about Bashar al-Assad, the future of Bashar al-Assad is being decided by his people, is not decided by such a kind of opposition which are pro-Israel, who were appealing Israel, the historic enemy of Syria, to intervene in Syrian territories. I don't understand some of our colleagues in the opposition, how they are thinking. They believe that they can change all the game relying on external support or by military means. This was senseless. This was not... this destroyed Syria. They are responsible about the destruction of
Russia external support?
And gentlemen, I'm going to have to stop on that intervention. My apologies, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much to my guests, Rami Jara, Taleb Ibrahim and Asad Al-Aichi. And I want to thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/ AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. For me and the rest of the team, goodbye.